My name is Rosalind Vasquez, and I am 31 years old. And the morning I canceled a standing bank transfer I had been sending every month for 2 years, I was sitting at my kitchen table in a bathrobe drinking Earl Grey tea from a dented tin that had been on my counter since the apartment before this one. It was a Tuesday in late October. The sky outside my window was the specific gray that comes just before the first real cold sets in. I remember that sky. I remember the tea. I remember the exact way the confirmation screen said, in plain black text, next scheduled transfer, none. I closed the app. I set my phone face down on the wooden cutting board beside the sink. I finished my tea. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel afraid. I felt something quieter than either of those things, something I would spend the next several weeks learning to name. This is the story of 24 months of transfers I never should have agreed to, one evening I spent listening through a half-open door, and the very ordinary Tuesday when I decided to stop. My husband's name is David. We have been married for 4 years. He is a good man. I want to say that clearly because this story is not about him being a villain. David works in logistics for a mid-sized freight company, earns a stable salary, and has never once asked me to carry a burden he would not carry himself. The problem was never David. The problem was his sister, Petra. Petra is 36, 5 years older than me, and she has lived the particular kind of adult life that looks, from a distance, like a series of things that happened to her rather than choices she made. She and her husband Clement had bought a house in 2019 at the outer edge of what their combined income could support, and by early 2021, after Clement's hours were cut and a bathroom pipe failed in the kind of catastrophic, insurance gap way that only happens to people who can least afford it, they were short every month in a way that was real and stressful, and I genuinely understood. David came to me in February of that year. He was quiet about it, the way David is quiet about things that embarrass him. He sat at the same kitchen table where I would later cancel the transfer, and he said, "Petra needs some help. Just for a few months." I asked how much. He said, $600 a month. Just until Clement gets his hours back. I was 30 years old, and I was working as a patient care coordinator at a pediatric clinic on the east side of the city. I was making $51,400 a year before taxes. $600 a month was not nothing, but it was manageable. And Petra was family. I said yes. That is the part one want you to understand about the beginning. I said yes because I believed it. I believed it was temporary. I believed it was a kindness. I believed that family is what you do when things go sideways for someone you share a dinner table with. The first transfer left my personal account, not our joint account, which I want to note, on March 1st of that year. I had set it up as a standing order. $600. Petra and Clement Ravenel. The memo line said loan because that was how I had thought of it. Clement got his hours back in May. The transfer kept going. I noticed, of course. I am not someone who fails to notice a recurring charge on her own bank statement. But when I brought it up to David in June, gently, over dinner, his face did something complicated and he said, "They're still catching up. They had a lot of damage from the pipe." And because I loved him, and because I was not looking for a fight, and because I had told myself this was temporary, I let it go. I let it go again in September. I let it go in December, when Petra and Clement came to our apartment for Christmas, and Petra told a long story about redecorating their living room, and I sat there calculating that the new curtains she was describing were probably roughly what I'd sent her in November. I let it go 7 more times after that. Here's something I understood about Petra that I had a harder time saying out loud back then. She had grown up as the baby of the family, the one who was smoothed over and sorted out, and she had internalized that dynamic so completely that she no longer recognized it as a dynamic. She genuinely believed that people helping her was just how the world worked. It was not cruelty. It was not scheming. It was something more like a wound she had never been asked to look at. The wound of never having had to stand fully in the consequences of her own choices, and therefore never having built the muscle for it. I did not understand this clearly until much later. What I understood in real time was that the loan I had agreed to had quietly become a subsidy, and the person receiving it did not seem to notice the difference. By October of the following year, I had sent Petra and Clement $14,400. I had not told my parents. I had not told my closest friend from work, a woman named Soledad who had been listening to my elliptical non-complaints about the Ravenel situation for months, without knowing the actual numbers. I had not told my therapist, Dr. Miriam Chavez, who I saw every other Thursday at 4:15 p.m. and who had been gently asking me, for most of those sessions, why I kept describing myself as fine in a tone of voice that did not sound like fine. I kept it to myself because I thought keeping it to myself was what a good daughter-in-law did. I thought a lot of things in those years that I have since revised. Some kindnesses are loans the lender forgets they are making. And when the person receiving them forgets too, what was once generosity becomes, very quietly, an obligation you never actually signed. The evening that changed things was a Wednesday in mid-October, 11 days before I canceled the transfer. David had come home from work and called Petra on his phone while I was in the kitchen finishing the dishes. He had left his phone on the counter by the doorway, the kind of careless leaving that happens when you have been married long enough to feel comfortable in the same space, and I could hear the speakerphone clearly from where I stood at the sink. I was not eavesdropping. I want to say that plainly. Petra was telling David about a work conflict, a co-worker who had taken credit for something she had done. I was half listening, drying a pot, not particularly invested in the story. And then, with the easy confidence of someone who believes she is alone in a private thought, Petra said, "Your wife acts like she's better than us. You know, she always has this look when she comes over. Like she's doing us a favor just showing up." David said, "Come on, Rose doesn't think like that." Petra said, "I'm just telling you what I see. Clement says it too." I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on the dish towel with a small blue stripe that hangs on the oven handle. I walked to the other side of the kitchen and sat down at the table. I did not go to the doorway. I did not announce myself. I did not make a sound. I just sat with what I had heard and let it settle the way cold water settles, slowly, all the way to the bottom. David came in 20 minutes later. I did not tell him what I had heard. I made the conscious choice not to tell him that night. What I did instead was open my phone under the table, navigate to my banking app, and look at the transfer screen for a long time without touching it. I thought about the $14,400. I thought about the curtains. I thought about Petra's voice, that particular ease in it, the ease of a woman who has never had to wonder whether the help she receives is costing someone something. I put my phone away. I went to bed. I did not say a word about any of it. The next 11 days were not dramatic. That is one of the things I want you to understand about this story. I did not spend those days in a spiral of rage or grief. I spent them thinking clearly, the way you sometimes think clearly once the noise finally stops and you can hear yourself again. I made a list in the small handwritten ledger I keep in the kitchen drawer, the one David calls my paper brain because I still prefer writing things down. The list had 2 columns. The left column said, "Things I chose." The right column said, "Things that became assumed." The left column was one line. Said yes in February one time for a few months. The right column took up the rest of the page. I sat with that page for 3 days. On the 4th day, I called Soledad. Soledad Ingleton has been my work friend for 6 years, which is long enough that we have crossed the threshold from work friend to actual friend without either of us making a ceremony of it. She has the particular gift of listening without performing shock, which was exactly what I needed that afternoon when I called her on my lunch break and told her the actual number. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Rose, $14,000. $14,400, I said. "In 2 years." "Yes," she said. "And she called you proud?" I said yes. She said, "Okay. What do you want to do?" That was the question. Not, "You should." Not, "You have to." Just, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to stop." She said, "Then stop." It was not more complicated than that. And it was also somehow the most complicated thing I had done in years. The night before I canceled the transfer, I sat at my desk in the second bedroom at 11:22 p.m. with my banking app open and a spreadsheet on my laptop that I had titled, with some dark humor, "The Reckoning." The spreadsheet was a simple thing, 24 rows, each one a month, each one showing $600 going out. A running total at the bottom. A column for what I had been doing that month at work, what was happening in my life, whether I had mentioned the transfer to anyone. Most of that last column was empty. I looked at the total for a long time. I looked at my savings account, which sat at $3,812.47, lower than I had projected it would be at this point in my life. I had been planning to buy a proper desk chair for my office. The one I was currently sitting in was a dining chair, hard-backed, slightly too low, and I had been pushing that purchase back for 4 months because the math was always a little tighter than I wanted to admit out loud. I stared at the dining chair for a moment, in the dim light of the laptop screen, and something in my chest shifted. It was not rage. It was not self-pity. It was closer to grief. The specific grief of recognizing that you have been diminishing yourself in small, monthly, automatic increments and no one forced you to, and that is somehow both the hardest and the most necessary thing to sit with. I had been doing this for 2 years. I had been skipping the chair, skipping the question, skipping the conversation, because it was easier to be easy. I closed the spreadsheet. I did not send an email. I did not go wake David and explain what I was thinking. I did not rehearse a speech or prepare a statement. I just sat there in the quiet dark of the second bedroom, in the pale light of a laptop screen, and I let myself feel what I actually felt, tired and clear and ready to be done. I did not cry. I did not argue with myself. I did not give myself the scene of doubt I half expected. The next morning, I opened the app. I found the standing transfer. I tapped cancel. I read the confirmation. I closed the app. I set my phone face down on the wooden cutting board beside the sink. I poured the Earl Grey. I sat down. The sky outside was gray. The apartment was quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence felt like it belonged to me. For 3 days, nothing happened. I went to work. I ate lunch with Soledad. I came home. I cooked. I watched David fall asleep on the couch watching television the way he always does, one sock half on, head tilted toward his shoulder, and I felt, for the first time in months, like my life was my actual size. Not stretched thin across someone else's shortfall. My size. On the 3rd day, Petra called David. I was in the kitchen when I heard his voice shift. That particular register shift, the one I had learned over 4 years, meant Petra was on the line. He took the phone to the back of the apartment. I heard his voice for about 12 minutes, low and careful. When he came back, he stood in the doorway between the hallway and the kitchen and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. Something sitting between confusion and apology. He said, "Did you cancel the transfer to Petra?" I said, "Yes." He said, "She said it didn't come through, and she thought it was a bank error." I said, "It wasn't a bank error." He sat down at the table. He was quiet for a moment. I watched him think. Then he said, "Can I ask why?" I had thought about this conversation. I had actually written down what I wanted to say in the handwritten ledger, 3 sentences, and I had read them enough times that I knew them without looking. I said, "I agreed to $600 a month for a few months. 2 years ago. Clement's hours came back in May of that year. I kept sending it anyway because I didn't want to cause a problem. I've decided to stop causing myself a problem instead." David looked at me for a long time. He said, "She's going to be upset." I said, "I know." He said, "Okay." And then, after a pause, "I'm sorry I didn't notice how long it had been going on." That was the moment I understood one of the things I had been doing without realizing it. By keeping the ledger to myself, by protecting David from the full picture, I had also kept him from being a full partner in the situation. I had made it easier for him not to see what I was absorbing. I had done the math alone, so he wouldn't have to. And then I had been quietly, monthly, resentful that he wasn't doing the math. That was not entirely fair of me. I was not proud of it. I filed it away. Petra called again the next day. David talked to her for 40 minutes. The day after that, she sent me a text. It said, "I just want to understand what changed. We are family, and I thought we had an agreement." I read it 3 times. I began writing a reply, deleted it. Wrote another, deleted that one too. Put my phone down, and went back to work. 2 days after that, Petra's mother-in-law, a woman I had met at Christmas exactly once, a small sharp woman named Dorina, who wore her hair in a tight silver bun and had a considered opinion about most things, called David to ask what was going on with the family. She had heard, apparently, that I had decided to cut off Petra. She had heard also that I had been acting cold toward Petra for months, and that this was the culmination of some long, private resentment I had been building. David told her that was not an accurate description. Dorina said she was just relaying what she had been told. The next morning, David told me that Petra had been telling members of Clement's extended family that I had decided I hated them, that I had declared some kind of war on the family, that I had been harboring contempt for years, and this was finally coming out. I had not declared anything. I had made a 4-tap decision on a banking app on a Tuesday morning while drinking Earl Grey tea. I had decided something much quieter and much more specific than hatred. I had decided to stop. The calls came in a pattern I began to track without meaning to, the way you notice the weather without deciding to watch it. Petra called David 11 times in the first 10 days after the cancellation. She sent me 6 texts, escalating in tone from confused to wounded to something that read, by the end, almost like a formal complaint. Clement sent 1 text, formal and hurt in equal measure, that said, "I hope you know what you're doing to this family." I read it. I set my phone on the kitchen counter. I went to make dinner. Dorina called again the second week. And David's mother, a woman named Irene who had always been genuinely kind to me, called on a Sunday evening to ask, gently and without accusation, if there was something she could do to help smooth things over. I told Irene I appreciated the call. I told her I had made a financial decision I was comfortable with, and that I hoped things would settle, and that I was not interested in a larger conversation about it until Petra and I could have a private one of our own. Irene said, "That sounds reasonable." I believe she meant it. On the 15th day, Petra texted asking if we could meet. She suggested a coffee place near her house. I suggested the cafe on Dunmore Street, 6 blocks from my apartment, where the woman who worked the morning shift knew my order without being asked. It was a small decision. I made it without ceremony. We met on a Thursday at 10 a.m. Petra was there before me, which surprised me. She had ordered a coffee. She looked tired, genuinely tired, with the particular tiredness of someone who has been fighting a battle on a front they did not expect to open. I felt the pull of that. The old pull. The one that says, "She's struggling, you can fix it." I sat down. I ordered tea. Petra said, "I don't understand why you didn't just talk to me." I said, "I did try to talk to David about it. More than once." She said, "That's not the same as talking to me." "No," I said. "It isn't." She said, "You made me feel like I did something wrong." I said, "I think the situation had gone on longer than either of us intended, and I should have addressed it sooner. I'm addressing it now." She said, "You're punishing us for one mistake." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as stopping something that had gone past what I originally agreed to." She looked at her coffee. She said, "We were counting on it." And that was the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about where we were. Not, "I'm sorry you felt taken for granted." Not, "I didn't realize how long it had been going on, and I should have asked." Not even, "Thank you for the 2 years." Just, "We were counting on it." As a fact. As a fixed feature of the landscape. As something that simply existed in the world the way rent exists, or electricity, or weather. I said, "I know. I'm sorry the transition is hard. I wanted you to know it wasn't about disliking you." She didn't respond to that. We finished our drinks. We walked out separately. I stood on the sidewalk outside the cafe for a moment in the cold and breathed, and then I walked home. The weeks that followed were not a resolution. I want to be honest about that, because stories like this one are often told as if there is a clean ending, a moment where the lesson lands and everyone understands their part, and the family reorganizes itself sensibly. That is not what happened. What happened was messier and quieter, and more real than that. Clement and Petra did not collapse. They found a way to cover the gap. I learned through David, several weeks later, that they had taken on a small line of credit and that Clement had picked up weekend work. It was uncomfortable. It required adjustment. And it was theirs to manage. It had always been theirs to manage. I had just been standing in the way of that for 2 years, absorbing what was rightfully their problem to solve, and calling that love. David and I had 3 conversations in the month after the coffee with Petra that were better than any we had had in a long time. Better because I was not filtering myself through the need to protect him from the full picture. He told me he was sorry he had not paid closer attention to what was happening. He told me he understood why I had handled it the way I did, even if he wished I had come to him sooner. I told him he was right about the sooner part. We held both of those things at the same time, without either of us needing to win the point, and that was its own kind of progress. Irene had us for dinner the following month. Petra and Clement were not there. She made the lamb stew she had made for us at our first Christmas together, and we sat at her kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, a movie David wanted to see, a trip Irene was thinking about taking in the spring, and I was grateful for the ordinariness. Grateful for a table where I could simply sit. Petra and I did not speak again for 6 weeks. When we did, it was at David's company holiday party, in a room full of people who did not know our history, and we were polite to each other with the careful politeness of 2 women who are still working out what comes next. I did not perform warmth. I did not perform coldness. I was simply present and measured and not afraid of her discomfort the way I had once been. That, I realized later, was the actual change. Not the transfer. Not the cafe. Not the calls I let ring. The actual change was that I had stopped being afraid of her discomfort. I began seeing Dr. Miriam Chavez every week instead of every other Thursday. I told her the actual number on our first session back. She did not perform surprise. She said, with the quiet matter-of-factness I have always appreciated in her, "So you've been subsidizing their household at some cost to your own for 2 years, mostly in silence." I said, "Yes." She said, "And now you've stopped." I said, "Yes." She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "Like I can breathe at my own size again." She wrote something down in her notebook. I did not ask what it was. I did not need to. I have been thinking lately about what I would say to the version of myself who opened that banking app in February 2 years ago and set up the standing transfer. I do not think I would tell her not to do it. The impulse was real, and it was not wrong. Petra and Clement were in a genuine bind, and I was in a position to help, and wanting to help was not a failing. The kindness itself was not the mistake. The mistake was the silence I wrapped around it afterward. The way I let a temporary thing become a permanent thing without anyone saying a word. The way I kept renewing a decision I had made once, passively, automatically, month after month, until it had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a fact of my life. An agreement is not a debt you owe forever. A yes you gave one time is not a yes that renews on its own. I had been paying an obligation I had never actually agreed to, not because I was naive, not because I could not see what was happening, but because I had decided somewhere along the way that keeping the peace was worth more than keeping my own ledger honest. I had decided that being easy was the same as being loving. It is not. There is a kind of love that asks you to make yourself smaller so someone else can stay comfortable. It wears the face of family. It uses the language of need. It sounds like, "After everything we did for you, and you're the only one who can do this, and we were counting on it." And for a long time, it is very convincing because it arrives in the voice of people you actually care about, and caring about them makes you want to believe the request is reasonable. But love that demands you shrink is not love. It is management. Family without respect becomes entitlement, and entitlement grows teeth the moment you build something it cannot reach. Forgiveness is not access. Understanding is not reunion. And stopping a payment is not the same as withdrawing love. Even if the people who benefited from the payment need to believe that it is, because believing that is easier than acknowledging what they took. I do not hate Petra. I have never hated Petra. I think she is a person who has not yet had to fully reckon with the cost of her own patterns, and I think that reckoning is coming for her in one form or another, the way it comes for all of us eventually. I hope it is gentler on her than mine was on me. I genuinely mean that. But I am done funding the delay. The Earl Grey tin is still on my counter. The wooden cutting board is still beside the sink. The handwritten ledger is still in the kitchen drawer, and its last entry on this subject is a single line in the right column, underlined twice. Done. My phone is face up now most mornings. I bought the desk chair in December. It fits the room exactly right. And the transfer is still canceled. Not as a punishment, not as a statement, not as a lesson anyone was supposed to learn. Simply because I made a decision once and I kept it, and it turned out that was something I was capable of. Roles can be recast. The first person who needs to know you are done shrinking is you. If someone in your life has turned a yes you gave them once into a yes that renews automatically, every month in silence, ask yourself when you decided that was the cost of belonging. And ask yourself what it would mean on just one ordinary Tuesday morning to let the next transfer simply not go through. Some doors you close once, and then you finally get to see who is actually standing in front of them the whole time.